I'm excited to be joined today by Pedro Gabriel, a founding member of the website WherePeterIs. Pedro is a Catholic layman, an oncologist by trade, born and residing in Portugal. He is a published writer of Catholic novels with a Tolkienite flavour and is also a former catechist. Pedro joins me today to talk about Pope Francis's Encyclical Fratelli Tutti. Pedro, welcome and thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Can I invite you to just take a step back and briefly give us an idea of the main vision of WherePeterIs, your involvement with the website, and how you got involved with Catholic apologetics?
Let's start with the last question. I got involved with Catholic apologetics at the time of Benedict XVI. Benedict XVI, as you might remember, was constantly being, his words were constantly being twisted by the secular media. They projected onto him an image that was not accurate. He was seen as a hardliner, ultra-conservative, and not as the nuanced and deep intellectual that he is. And that's something that I liked a lot about him. So I could not stand idle while he was attacked, and I started my own blog at the time in Portuguese, but my apologetics at the time were mainly confined to the Portuguese language realm. Later on, when Pope Francis was elected, the same thing started to happen, but from an unexpected side. Instead of being the secular media constantly maligning the Pope and twisting the Pope, it was the Catholic media that I had relied so much during so many years. So I just started doing the same with Francis that I did with Benedict. But of course, others also noticed these attacks, and we kind of met together online, and we decided that enough was enough, and there was a need online to have a voice that would counteract all this disinformation that has been spread about Pope Francis. And that's basically how I come today.
Fantastic. And thank you very much for the work that you do at WherePeterIs.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
Fratelli Tutti is Pope Francis's third papal encyclical after Lumen Fidei in 2013 and Laudato Si in 2015. It was released to coincide with the feast of St. Francis of Assisi and revolves around Catholic social teaching. I would invite you to comment on the key themes of the encyclical, Pedro, with an aim of drawing deep levels of thought to the new evangelization, salvation history, eschatology. But before we do that, can I ask you to attempt to summarize the encyclical at a headline level? Father Satish Joseph, a contributor to WherePeterIs, proposes Fratelli Tutti is Pope Francis's love letter to the world. Others have said that this letter comes at a time when the world is on the brink of utter despair and societal collapse, a call for peace among brothers and sisters, all humanity. If you were to distill Fratelli Tutti from your perspective, how would you summarize it?
Fratelli Tutti can be summarized in one sentence. It's fraternity as the Catholic Church teaches it. We need to rediscover the value of fraternity because it is the antidote for many ills that we see today, from the COVID pandemic to the rise of many ideologies that are based on the fear of the other, ideologies that are based on pure individualism. Francis provides us with the antidote. We need to see ourselves again as brothers and sisters. Now, this fraternity needs to be rightly understood, because fraternity has also been kind of distorted. It has been incorporated into the French Revolution motto, liberty, equality, fraternity. Of course, this means that there is an image of fraternity that is projected by by secular movements, and we need to understand it in the proper Catholic context. In fact, it's actually quite interesting that Pope Francis has says that fraternity can actually help purify the other values, liberty and equality, because Francis notes that where many of those secular movements went wrong is because they had a liberty that was seen as an absolute value, not tempered by fraternity. The same thing with equality. So fraternity can actually be the value that can redeem the other two and redeem many other things that we see today.
From solidarity to fraternity, racism to the economy, just war to the death penalty, private property to immigration, religious freedom to the UN, social media and the internet, Fratelli Tutti is extensive in its scope, a tour de force on Catholic social teaching, covering weighty subjects. It's not in the scope of this interview to cover all of this. I'm going to propose some areas we can focus on and hopefully draw out some of the deeper themes. Time permitting, we can then drill into detail and cover some of the common criticisms and objections which you've already touched on, Freemasonry and communism being the usual critiques, for example. In introducing the encyclical in his Angelus address on the 4th of October, Pope Francis said, quote, "The signs of the times clearly show that for human fraternity and the care of creation form the only path towards integral development and peace." Can you elaborate on what Pope Francis meant by this, in particular by the signs of the times and the only route to peace?
There are some threats to to peace nowadays. Namely, I mentioned two. I mentioned the COVID pandemic, which obviously creates situations of social isolation, or situations in which society might move at different speeds. We need to overcome this together. We will not be able to overcome this if we don't work together. And the other thing is precisely the ideologies that I mentioned: nationalism, globalism, individualism. All these isms, they are based on a kind of just focusing on the individual and not on the bonds that connect us all. So these are sources of conflict. Wherever these ideas thrive, there's going to be conflict, because these ideas, these movements, they divide. They are based on division. There's us and there's the other, and the other is not like us. So of course, this will obviously breed conflict. And fraternity, if we want to have peace, if we want to overcome these conflicts, we need fraternity. We need to build bridges that will go beyond all these limitations that sometimes are limitations that are imposed on us from an outside force, non-human force like COVID, But sometimes these divisions are artificially created by us, by our concupiscence, by our sin.
Catholic social teaching, does it get the attention it deserves? Have recent generations forgotten about it? And how relevant is it to the fabric of Christianity?
Catholic social teaching, I wouldn't say that it is forgotten. It is very difficult to forget something that is not even known. Okay, you're correct in pointing out that Fratelli Tutti is a social encyclical. It comes in a long line of tradition dating back to Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum. And it is impressive, like ideologies have come and go, come and disappeared. They are replaced by new ideological fads, new ideological trends. But at the same time, Catholic social teaching remains always the same, but also grows by confronting each of these new ideologies. And of course, it is important as a compass that will guide us politically. Pope Francis, in the same line of Pius XI, shows that there is such a thing as political charity. Pius XI preferred the term social charity, but it's exactly the same. As men, as human beings, we are a political animal. And as human beings, everything that we do must be directed towards love. So we need to find a way to orient our political activity towards love. Where there is no love, there's no God. And where there's no God, well, there's hell, by definition.
Yeah. I want to begin unpicking some of the big, major topics in this encyclical. Pope Francis calls for globalization in a truly Catholic sense. The polyhedron analogy is often used by him to help us understand how to defeat the globalization poisoned by ideological colonization. He also stresses the importance of recognizing humanity's common origin and destiny, our common humanity. How important is the meshing of cultures for peace, global peace?
Yes, that's also very, very important. It is important to highlight that Francis is not in favor of globalism per se, but in favor of a certain kind of globalism. Pope Francis has a very important part in Fratelli Tutti 12. He actually quotes a very beautiful sentence from Caritas in Veritate, from Benedict XVI. He says that as society becomes ever more globalized, it makes us neighbors, but it does not make us brothers. So we need the globalism that will make us brothers. That's what fraternity is all about. Pope Francis talks about the globalization of indifference in chapter 30. What reigns instead is a cool, comfortable, and globalized indifference. And I think it was John Paul II who said, the opposite of love is not always hatred. There's another opposite of love, it's indifference, because he who is indifferent does not love. So we need to read this. We need the good kind of globalism, and that kind of globalism has the polyhedron at its center. That's the metaphor that Pope Francis uses both in Fratelli Tutti and across his work. he has talked about this. So Francis started this metaphor of the polyhedron in an in-flight conference press in January 2015. And he says, when conditions are imposed by colonizing empires, they seek to make these people lose their own identity and create uniformity. This is a spherical globalization. A sphere. All points are equidistant from the center. A true globalization is not a sphere, it's a polyhedron. Each people, every part, preserves its identity without being ideologically colonized. And that's what the polyhedron is all about. People don't need to sacrifice their own identity, but it's precisely because we live in a globalized society that each identity has a voice in the world stage. And each voice needs to be recognized and respected, as long as it does not go against the common good, of course.
Yeah, I find the we'll get onto this a bit later on. I want to get your views, Pedro, on assimilation, the power of Catholicism in regard of assimilation, and I feel like it can be applied to globalization as well as the ideals of the French Revolution that you've already touched on. I think that's an interesting point, but we'll kind of get onto that in a bit. In the themes of dialogue and fraternity, Pope Francis is speaking to the entire world. Indeed, this encyclical is addressed to all people of goodwill, billions of people. Nostra Aetate and Dignitatis Humanae, promoting interreligious dialogue and protecting religious freedom, are increasingly prevalent missions in the Francis pontificate. One of my favourite quotes from Fratelli Tutti is, "Those who claim to be unbelievers can sometimes put God's will into practice better than believers." Is the increasingly urgent call for unity at a base human level prophetic?
Well, I actually think so. One thing that sometimes gets some people confused or even anxious is Pope Francis's constant calls for us to not have rigorous or rigid Christianity. You must understand that, of course, there are values that we can never compromise on. There are things that are intrinsically evil, but sometimes the Holy Spirit wants to bring us somewhere, and we do not allow it because we just place our own opinions on the way, and we don't allow ourselves to be guided because we think that our opinions are God's will. Okay, and sometimes the Holy Spirit may actually bring us to our brothers who are outside the church, not just to bring them into the church, which is important, of course, but sometimes there's things we can learn from them. And the church has always done this, okay? What we call Thomism is Catholicization of Aristotelian thought, he was pagan, okay? So sometimes being prophetic, that's prophetic, exactly. We need to encounter the other cultures and find out what we can learn from them. Cardinal Newman said that one of the principles of a legitimate development of doctrine is the power of assimilation. We assimilate what is good from the outside, from outside forces, from outside the church. We assimilate what is good and we reject what is not good. We can never be able to process this if we don't meet the other cultures, if we don't study the other cultures, and most importantly, if we don't hear the other cultures. But that's also very abstract. We also need to encounter our brothers who are outside, because sometimes, yes, they actually can provide us with a better example than some people inside the church can. Biblically speaking, we found many such characters. Ruth was a Moabite, and she actually learned the law better than some people from Israel. There's the Ethiopian that Saint Philip the Apostle found on the way. There's there's a Samaritan woman. Even if she was living in a state of sin, I believe that the apostles learned with her faith. So yeah, that it's very traditional. It's very traditional to meet the people from other cultures and assimilate. Nowadays, we think that the only way to many people who have a certain view of the past and of tradition, they think that the only way to encounter other cultures is to replace them and to destroy everything. But that's not traditional. The church usually does not behave like that in principle.
Yep. I completely agree with you on that, Pedro. And this leads quite nicely on to my next question. And it's on politics, and I want to get on to other things like the UN and that kind of thing. But in an article on WherePeterIs, you said that Pope Francis has repeatedly called for us to, quote, undergo what amounts to an ideological detox process of our faith.
Yes.
How much is Catholicism being afflicted by shallow political and ideological thinking?
Very much. Too much, in fact. I think we can see on social media the debates that go around, and even very powerful Catholic outlets. They are driven by political forces. And it seems like Catholicism sometimes is exhausted merely on how a person votes. It monopolizes all the discussion around Catholicism in social media. And I said this in a podcast with Mike Lewis on WherePeterIs. These Catholic media have elaborated theology of dissent, which is, there are things that there are political ideas that we can. There are actually tenets of Catholic social doctrine that we can just not accept. They are called prudential judgment, and they called it prudential judgment. And if it's prudential judgment, I can just reject it at will. And it's interesting because these politics, these policies that are rejected on the basis of prudential judgment, it's not like they are rejected once or twice. Like, I have difficulty understanding how to apply this principle on real life, so I'm not going to do it, but the rest of Catholic doctrine I accept. No, it's always according to the principles of a certain political party. What we see, and this happens on both sides of the political spectrum, is that Catholics want to change the church to fit their political parties, not to change their political parties to suit the Catholic teaching that they should profess. But if you go and study the actual doctrine, you see that there's nothing to sustain this idea that you can reject something just because it's prudential. If you go to Donum Veritatis, a CDF document, you see that you have to give submission of mind and will to the magisterium, even when it is not infallibly defined, because there's another idea that has been floating around, that it's not infallible, so I can reject it. No, there's a wealth of church documents saying no, you have to submit your mind and will, even if a magisterial pronouncement is not infallible. And even when it is prudential, Donum Veritatis says it's very dangerous to go against doctrine, okay? To go against these prudential decisions of the church. So it's not something that you do all the time whenever it conflicts with a political agenda. And I think that these political values that are extra Catholic, they do not flow from Catholicism. They have taken hold of this media and shaped many Catholics worldwide into something that is not Catholic. It's a mimicry of Catholicism at the service of political interests. And we need to stop this. Until we stop this, people are not going to accept Catholic doctrine as a whole, totally as it is. And that's wrong. That's not being Catholic. Never was.
I agree with you on that, and I think in the context of what you said, it really puts Pope Francis's pontificate in really good perspective, and why he challenges these problems. Moving on, and you touched on this a bit already, but the etymology of the word politics tells us that the Greeks proposed it as the affairs of the city. This appeal to a common ground is met with suspicion by many, scarred by the extremist ideologies which often succeed in temporal affairs. How does the Catholic Church get involved in influencing the shape of politics whilst remaining non-partisan?
Well, the way the Church has done it at the magisterial level, of course. Of course, throughout the centuries and millennia, popes and bishops have taken sides politically, even today. But magisterially, the Church does not subscribe to political parties. The Church gives us values, teachings that serve as a compass, and then each Catholic must use that compass in a way to see on every circumstance what is the better approach, the approach that is more in conformity with Catholic principles. And this is also not new. Very recently, I posted a quote from St. Pius X in a document called Notre Charge Apostolique, in which he railed against the political movement. But he said it's not part of the Church's idea, it's not part of the Church's stance to get involved in politics and to say, oh, this party or that party, or get in partisanship. I think St. Pius X talks about partisanship. No, of course, if the Church is attacked by a certain political force, we oppose it. We oppose that force. But as a matter of principle, the Church should just give us the values, give us the guidelines, and we, as lay people, as the Church that lives in the world, we do our best to apply those principles of political charity.
The Pope calls for the United Nations to not be delegitimized. We see from the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church and the rich history of papal dialogue with the UN that the Church has a mission to work with and to reform the UN. As we know, the UN epitomizes much of the Spiritus Mundi. Is the Church approaching this task correctly? Some call for a more combative approach, for example, but what's your view on that, Pedro? Is the Church approaching this mammoth task correctly?
Well, Francis, on one hand, he is just following up a long line of popes that have taken precisely the same stance. There have been many people criticizing Francis for saying that he wanted the United Nations with actual teeth. And they get scandalized by that, and they don't even realize that that's a literal verbatim quote from Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritate. This approach to the UN comes already from Paul VI. I think it was Paul VI who started, who made a speech in the United Nations. I might be wrong. I might have to check that out. But yeah, Paul VI was the one who started to have this approach, this proximity with the United Nations. And this actually is not coincidental, because Paul VI was the Pope that ended the Second Vatican Council. And what we see is that the Second Vatican Council, even if it did not change doctrine, contrary to what many critics say, it changed the approach. But, from the French Revolution, or even from the Reformation, until the Second Vatican Council, the Church had this combative attitude, this idea that the world is bad and we should retreat from the world and fight. That eventually led up to the fall of the Papal States, to the episode of the Pope being a prisoner in the Vatican, and lots of other things. That doesn't mean that it was wrong. I'm not saying it. I'm just saying that it had a cost. So there would have to come a time, as the world keeps increasing in power and the Church keeps decreasing in power, that the Church will have to get out of its shell. And the Church discerned that it was a time precisely in the Second Vatican Council. And that's when the attitude changed. It went from an attitude of fight to an attitude of cooperation. And what we see with the United Nations is precisely the development of that attitude as regards this specific topic. It does not mean that the Church accepts everything that comes from the United Nations. The things the United Nations promotes as a matter of sexuality, gender ideology, abortion, those things are abominable, and no Catholic can accept them. But on the other hand, we cannot be a valid interlocutor with the United Nations if we just keep ourselves from the outside. It's by being in dialogue with the United Nations that we can actually come up to them and say, we want to cooperate with you in your goals to abolish poverty, to protect the environment. Those are worthy goals, but we cannot accept this. So you need to respect us and understand that we are not some kind of force that we don't cooperate with you. You want our cooperation. You also need to listen to us. That's it. And the United Nations aren't, because we need a supranational structure that will prevent countries from acting in an immoral way, be it economically or in warfare. We need the United Nations. The two world wars of the 20th century and the Cold War showed the dangers of having each country for itself. I would actually like to bring to attention an article I wrote that has nothing to do with politics, but it has to do with tensions with the flavor of the gospel. This is actually a quote from Francis, and it's like the church is the body of Christ, and the body of Christ is crucified, and it's crucified on the left arm and on the right arm. It's stretched. It's in tension. It's only when we are in tension that we are being trustful to the gospel. So the church always tries to find a balance between tensions that seem unsurmountable, like God is a man and Jesus is God and Jesus is man. Oh, these things seem completely irreconcilable. But the church, instead of doing away with the tension, which was what the Arians did, it was what the monothelitism did, they embraced the tension because they knew that the truth was inside that tension. And we see this all the time. So here in the United Nations, it's exactly the same thing. There's this tension between what is good in the United Nations, what is bad in the United Nations, and we need to find the balance. If we do away with the tension and just embrace the United Nations uncritically or reject the United Nations uncritically, we are not being faithful to the truth.
I want to use this as a bit of a segue into economics. We've covered politics, the UN, so I want to move just into economics now. So as we know, capitalist societies prioritize liberty but lack equality. Socialist societies prioritize equality but restrict liberty. What is the role of fraternity in resolving this issue? Now, you've spoken a bit about this earlier, but in the context of economics.
Well, as I said, Pope Francis views fraternity as the way to humanize both liberty and equality. What we see in those ideologies is that they have an abstract view of those values. Liberty without equality. And sometimes what we see in those capitalist ideologies with liberty without equality is that people suffer poverty so that others might be free. And it's an abstract concept of freedom that is disconnected from the common good. I don't care what the common good is. I want to do what I want. And on the other side, there's equality without freedom, and that is also a way to dehumanize our brothers and sisters. It's also an abstract value to have equality. We see that, for example, on the gender ideology, in which there's equality and it's disconnected from the person as he or she is, because the person is a soul, but it's also a body. So I think that fraternity, what helps us is to ground these abstract values that have been appropriated by those ideologies and gives them a human form. Here is your brother, here is your sister. So how are you going to use your freedom and how are you going to promote equality? By looking at him or her, at the concrete person. Fraternity, by forcing us to see others as brothers and sisters, forces us to humanize liberty and equality. I think it's Pope Francis says so in Fratelli Tutti, that without fraternity, these ideas and these values turn out just like beautiful words, but without fraternity, they are nothing. They are like a clanging cymbal, as to appropriate what St. Paul said.
Yeah, but I almost feel as if economics and the economy, it just hasn't, at least to my mind anyway, and I'm not really well read on this, but it almost seems to me like the urgency with which Pope Francis is tackling economics is prophetic, and I think what is the fundamental flaw in the economy of today? It is greed, lust for money and power.
Yes. Pope Francis uses the term concupiscence, not in the sexual way. It's interesting, but precisely for greed. He uses that word in Fratelli Tutti.
Yeah. Consumerism and the throwaway culture. How blind, to use a strong word, how blind do you think we in the West are to how such a large part of the world live?
Well, we are really very blind. And that's precisely the reason why we need to start listening to other cultures and not think that just because we're from the West that we can actually. It's interesting that Pope Francis also rails against something that is called that he calls assistentialism, which is I'm going to help you, but I don't need to listen to you and listen to your needs or even see you as a human being. I can help you and use politics to help you, and I will impose my help on you according to my own ideas, according to my own perceived, according to my own interpretation of reality, and that's not correct. First of all, we need to hear the people who need to be helped. What do they actually need? What is their story? What are their values? And we must remember, some of these cultures are actually Catholic in South America and Africa, but we on the West sometimes look down on them and we think they are all pagans and whatnot, and we don't give them a place at the table. I think it's very interesting. Pope Francis, before publishing Fratelli Tutti, this year, his Wednesday audiences were actually about social doctrine principles, and applied to the COVID pandemic. But he again taught about the traditional principles of solidarity and subsidiarity. And as I said elsewhere, we tend to see those two values as two opposing forces, and we need to balance. We need to balance solidarity with subsidiarity. But Francis does not see it that way. He sees subsidiarity as an expression of solidarity. You want to help people, but you help people according to their own terms, according to their own experience. So you invite that person to the table, you listen to that person, and then you all together find out the best way to help that person, to help that country. So yes, we in the West have been very blind, even sometimes with good intentions, but we need to start opening our eyes, and it's our brothers and sisters who can do that. We cannot do it ourselves.
The universal destination of goods versus temporal subsidiarity, which you mentioned there. Private property flows from universal destination of goods.
Yes.
What has Fratelli Tutti changed on this matter, if anything?
Well, I don't think Fratelli Tutti much changed much on this matter, as it has brought it to light. Um, People have been criticizing Fratelli Tutti, saying that Pope Francis is contradicting Leo the 13th, because Pope Francis says that the private property is not inviolable, whereas Leo the 13th says that private property is inviolable, and that would be a contradiction. What they fail to know is that this is a translation problem. If you go to the original Spanish, which is Pope Francis' actual language, you see that he doesn't say that the private property is inviolable. He says untouchable. And untouchable is exactly the word that exists in the compendium of social doctrine. So again, Pope Francis, when he says that the universal destination of goods, that private property flows from the universal destination of goods, he's not saying anything new. What he's saying is profoundly traditional. Universal destination of goods is one of the principles of Catholic social doctrine. What does it, and it comes from the church fathers. What does it mean? It means that God created the earth for all of mankind. This is obvious. This is self-evident. God did not create this to this group of people. The earth belongs to you, and I created these other human beings, but the earth does not belong to them. That's not how God works. So the earth belongs to the whole of mankind, and private property is the way that exists for each person to be assured that he or she is capable of receiving his or her fair share of this earth that belongs to all of us. If there were no private property, that person would never be able to enjoy his or her fair share, period. So private property is needed, is inviolable, because it's the way through which each person is able to enjoy the universal destination of goods. Now, if we violate the universal destination of goods in order to protect private property, that's no good. We are sawing the branch where we're sitting on. It's a perversion of private property. Private property is inviolable in as much as it comes from the universal destination of goods. If private property did not come from the universal destination of goods, then it would not be anything special.
I want to continue with our zoom into the key themes, Pedro, and just talk about just war. But then I want to zoom out again and bring us onto some broader themes, and then we can, time permitting, get onto the common objections. How are you doing for time? Can I just check?
I'm fine.
Good, perfect. Good. On just war, Pope Francis presents a genuine development within the confines of continuing tradition. Does the claim of Pope Francis regarding just war being inadmissible have anything to do with the fact that it is very difficult to distinguish who the good guys in the world in this present day and age are? I'm thinking, for example, of the West's involvement in the Middle East and the web of proxies at play geopolitically. Without getting too bogged down in geopolitics and that kind of thing, is Pope Francis prophetic in turning to a just war teaching that flexes with our time?
Yes, I think he is prophetic. I would not say that he actually went there in saying that just war is admissible at this moment, but he came very, very, very near. But it must be remembered that this is something that is also not very new. I think that Benedict XVI already entertained this idea, and interestingly, one of the most conservative cardinals in the Second Vatican Council, Cardinal Ottaviani, has proposed that war would be considered today intrinsically evil. Why? Because just war is a doctrine that was formulated by St. Augustine very early on, when things were very different. And one of the principles of just war is that you will not use disproportionate means. Now, what we see nowadays is that it's very difficult to wage a war that has no disproportionate means. We have weapons of mass destruction that can wipe out a complete city, and it destroys indiscriminately. It destroys the combatants and the non-combatants. It destroys men, women, children, old people, everything and everyone. So is it really possible to apply the principles of just war today? It's not that the church has changed her teaching. It's that the world has changed in such a way that applying the principles of just war nowadays seems impossible. So yes, regarding the Middle East, regarding every conflict, I think that today, I don't think that Pope Francis has considered that war is inadmissible, but he surely gave a call to try for us to try to see war as if it were inadmissible and try to solve our problems in other ways. And here is where the United Nations actually comes in. The United Nations is a valuable resource to avoid many wars that, if it were not for the United Nations, probably would have already been waged. So we need to focus on that positive aspect of the United Nations and try as much as possible. This is self-evidently Christian. We must try as much as possible to solve problems and solve conflicts without going around and killing people. That's so self-evidently Christian. I don't know why it's so hard for people to understand this, and it's almost like, our political party or our country supports this war, so I don't care what Catholic doctrine teaches. It's prudential judgment, blah blah. So that's not a way for a Catholic to live his or her religion, in my opinion.
Yeah. In the context of these changes to just war and the death penalty, changes in inverted commas, I'll say that. How does Catholic tradition evolve and develop? I know that's a very broad, general question, but how does it evolve and develop? Because I think that this is a point that many struggle with, and an important one.
Okay. Regarding the death penalty, I actually wrote an article about that death penalty, hardness or continuity or hardness of heart. It's a very long article. It's kind of difficult to summarize it because it has kind of a step-by-step approach. But very, very summarily, what we see is that the death penalty, as when Pope Francis says that the death penalty is inadmissible, they just pull it to the area of morality, and that previous Pope said that it's not intrinsically evil, and now it seems like Pope Francis is saying that it's intrinsically evil. Now, I think that Pope Francis is very careful. Contrary to what many people say, I think he's very careful with his words, and he tried to avoid this theological conundrum wherein a pope says something that there's a church teaching that contradicts other church teaching. What happens is Pope Francis is not saying that death penalty is now intrinsically evil. He just says that there are some factors. The world has changed. We have better ways to mete out justice. We have an increased awareness of human dignity. We have these factors, and they make us think that maybe we don't need the death penalty. So if we don't need the death penalty, imposing the death penalty is actually unchristian in this historical context. There were times when it was needed. There were times when the church emphasized justice more than mercy. This is a matter of emphasis. But nowadays, the church, to go and mete out the world, the church must emphasize mercy. Okay? So I think that trying to have death penalty at this moment, it's not needed. Most countries that have high index of democracy and quality of life and low criminality rates, the West, Europe, they don't have death penalty, so they don't need it. So why are we going to keep the death penalty in our laws if we are able to have less criminality and a greater respect for our brothers and sisters, even if they are criminals? Why would we do that when we don't need it? Actually, doing it would be unchristian, and it doesn't have anything to do with the societies from 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. It was completely different at the time. I actually want just to also say that Portugal, my country, was one of the first countries to abolish the death penalty, and we did it while we were a thoroughly Catholic country. And I don't think there was any pope that protested against it. We did that in the 1850s, if I'm not mistaken. No pope said that we were less Catholic for being so, and we are a thoroughly Catholic country. So that's precisely it. It's an evolution. It's an organic evolution. It has continuity. It's not a matter of the church contradicted herself. No, it's a matter of circumstances made it so that we don't need it anymore. So if we don't need it, let's not use it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the concept of a living tradition has been slightly lost in some parts of the Catholic world. And it's an important thing to bear in mind, as you said, Pedro. How significant are the influences of Saint Francis and the Jesuit tradition on Pope Francis's pontificate?
I think those influences are obvious. First of all, Pope Francis is a Jesuit. We notice that Pope Francis has a great emphasis on discernment, which is also a very important part of the Jesuit spirituality. We see this idea of discernment in Amoris Laetitia. We see this idea of discernment across the way Pope Francis deals with the several synods, and obviously that influences his magisterium. Regarding Saint Francis, it's the saint whose name is his namesake. Two of his encyclicals actually come their titles come from Saint Francis. Laudato Si is a hymn from Saint Francis, and Fratelli Tutti is also a sentence, a quote from Saint Francis. His emphasis on the poor. So, just by looking at it, we can see Saint Francis' deep influence on our current Pope. His concern for the Pope, his concern for nature, all of that comes in the tradition of Saint Francis.
Within these political, economical, and inter-religious themes, there's a bit of a pervasive and popular zeitgeist. Manichaeism, duality,
Yes.
absolute good and bad,
Yes.
is becoming many people's way of making sense of an at times hopeless world. Do you have any reflections on this?
So I think that regarding that question of polarization, better than my own words, it is better to let Pope Francis speak for himself. And here in Fratelli Tutti, chapter 16, he says, amid the fray of conflicting interests, where victory consists in eliminating one's opponents, how is it possible to raise our sights to recognize our neighbors, or to help those who have fallen along the way? We are growing ever more distant from one another, while the slow and demanding march towards an increasingly united and just world is suffering a new and dramatic setback. So Pope Francis tackles the problem of polarization very deeply, and he tries to pull us down to the only duality that interests, that is important. And he goes later on to say this in chapters 69 and 70. The decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. The distinctions between Judean and Samaritan, priest and merchant, fade into insignificance. Now there are only two kinds of people: those who care for someone who is hurting and those who pass by, those who bend down to help and those who look the other way and hurry off. Here, all our distinctions, labels, and masks fall away. So this is the only polarization that matters: those who, in a spirit of the Good Samaritan, help their brother and sister in need, and those who do not. All other labels, all other divisions, all other polarities must be judged according to this, according to love.
In a video that I've posted on this channel, I've proposed that there is a Pharisaical spirit which is afflicting Catholic tradition.
Yes.
Jesus came, we saw too that the Pharisees were bogged down in legalism. Absolute good, absolute bad. There is a bit of a tenuous link there. Was Vatican II a way of helping the Church rediscover the simplicity of the gospel?
Yes, of course, completely. But yes, the Pharisees had this also this duality, of course, the polarity between those who are pure and those who are impure, between the ones that belong to the people of Israel and the ones who were not the chosen people. So yes, we can say that the Pharisees were also instruments of polarization. But I think that the greatest error of the Pharisees was that they saw that there's God's law, and that is immutable, that cannot change. But they had added many of their own human laws to God's law, and then they just saw these structures of the law, these legalisms, and they didn't go and see the actual concrete person they had in front of them. And I think Pope Francis is actually also helps us in combating Pharisaism when he in Evangelii Gaudium he says realities are greater than ideas. We need to see the concrete person in front of us without compromising God's law. But God's law is always at the service of the person, is always an instrument of love that God has towards that person. So I think that Francis has been also instrumental in avoiding this Pharisaism, but we must also be mindful that this Pharisaism can actually be accomplished in ways that we are not expecting. We are so used to think of the dissenters, the radical traditionalists as the Pharisees, but sometimes if we are not mindful, if we start idolizing the structures and certain unwritten rules above our concrete brother and sister, we can also become like that. And this can happen even in a secular mentality. People from a secular mentality might think, oh, I have this idea of what freedom is, or this idea of what an ideal society is, and I'm going to sacrifice my concrete brothers and sisters in the name of this abstract idea I have, because this brother and sister stands in the way. So that's Pharisaism too, in my opinion. So we need to be always self-reflecting, so as not to fall into this temptation, because the Pharisees were blinded by pride. They thought they had everything already figured out. So the others who did not partake of their illuminated conscience, the others could just be rejected.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with you, Pedro. It's definitely not exclusive to traditional Catholics, the Pharisaical Spirit. Someone put it to me really quite well, and I must remember the quote. I'm probably going to get it wrong, but traditional Catholicism lends itself to the Pharisaical Spirit, whereas liberal Catholicism lends itself to indifferentism. I thought that that's probably not a perfect quote, but I thought they encapsulate some truth. They're not mutually exclusive to one another, but the propensity to one and the other is captured quite well in that, I found.
Yeah, I would just like to make a distinction between there is obviously, these labels are kind of fluid, but I would like to make a distinction between traditionalists and radical traditionalists, because there are people who label themselves traditionalists because they have a certain liturgical affinity, and the church gives them freedom to express that affinity as long as they are faithful to the fullness of doctrine and to the popes, and I am completely okay with that. I'm talking now about radical traditionalists, the ones who want to have tradition without submission to the living magisterium. That's a problem, because that's false traditionalism. There has never been a time of the church in which tradition has been done against the living magisterium. And in that aspect, I must say that I really love the name of your podcast, Tradition Reclaimed, because that's precisely what we need to do. We need to reclaim tradition. they are sacrificing the well-established tradition of papal primacy and of the faithfulness that a Catholic must have to the magisterium to save other parts of tradition. That's paradoxical. And they are not more traditional than us by doing it. That's the opposite of traditional. Tradition is the submission to the living magisterium. And I actually coined a term. It was one of my first articles in WherePeterIs, which is sola traditio, in which I try kind of draw the parallels between these views on tradition and sola scriptura. It's very interesting how sometimes they mimic the arguments from those who advocate for sola scriptura, but they just do it. They do it for tradition, not for scripture. That's actually very interesting because tradition this is from the Catechism. Tradition and scripture are authoritatively interpreted by the living magisterium. And sometimes we might think, oh, but this thing that the Pope has said contradicts tradition. It's obvious. Well, it's also obvious in a sense that, oh, what the popes teach about iconoclasm contradicts scripture on not building graven images. The Catholic Church teaches that iconoclasm is a heresy, and they have good reason for it. So having contradictions on the surface does not make it like you can just appropriate the role of the authoritative interpreter of tradition and just make tradition as you go along. No. If scripture is not perspicuous, tradition is not perspicuous. And before Pope Francis was elected, the only people who were talking about papalatry or about heretical popes or about a great apostasy of the church were the Protestants. And people from those formerly faithful Catholic sites were defending the Pope from these accusations from the Protestants, and suddenly they adopted the same rhetorical tricks, but instead of being in favor of Scripture, they are doing it in favor of tradition. But again, that's a paradoxical way of looking at tradition. There is no tradition in the 2,000 years of the Church. There is no tradition that goes against the living magisterium.
Yep, and it is an important distinction that you made a moment ago as well. I think it's not in the scope of this video, maybe another time, but I think it's interesting. Americanism, the problem that was outlined a couple of centuries ago, and how it's coming into fruition in ways that people might not immediately see it is. But we've zoomed in on key issues. We've zoomed out. I want to move on to common objections, time permitting, and just cover a few of those. I've just got a few of the common objections listed out. But have we missed anything about the text itself, the context of the text, and just anything on Fratelli Tutti that we might have missed that you want to just cover before we move on to common objections?
The document is so rich that it's obvious that we're going to miss something. But I think we're good. I think we are. I think we have explored many interesting angles, in my opinion. Of course, we are also. We haven't gotten in depth with the nationalism and the populism. We mentioned globalism, indeed. But yeah, if you want, we can talk about it, or we can move on to the objections. It's fine by me.
Yeah, so let's cover one of the main objections, and you've already covered this when we set out. So, liberty, equality, fraternity. The motto of the French Revolution, which caused immense harm to Catholics, is the title to a subsection in Fratelli Tutti. To some, this is absolute proof that a Freemason has put himself in the very seat of Peter, but in the lens of the power of Catholic assimilation or enculturation, and in the context of Pope Francis's quest for peace, why has Pope Francis chosen to attack this point head on in Fratelli Tutti? Why has he mentioned this explicitly in Fratelli Tutti? Have you got a reflection on that?
No, I think that many popes have already tried to do that. I think even Leo the 13th tried to do that. So it's not completely new. What can be said that it's new is the insight that comes from Fratelli Tutti, that fraternity is the value that can help humanize the other two values. That's the newest insight. Liberty, equality, and fraternity are not exclusive to Freemasons. Before Freemasonry arrived, there was already idea that man is free, men and women, that God created every man and woman in his own image and likeness, so there's equality, that we have an Our Father. If there's an Our Father, we are all brothers and sisters. So these values need to be reclaimed, but they are not explicitly or exclusively Freemason, no. So I think it's important to get them back.
Pope Francis's views on abortion are clear. He has made absolution clearer and has extended copious amounts of mercy on the matter. But his views are clear, and there's no contradiction with established church teaching. But many charge Pope Francis on being soft on doctrine. What about abortion? What about euthanasia? What about human cloning? What do you make of the Pope's approach in this regard? Is he saying enough?
Yeah, he has said much about abortion and euthanasia, and even acted very strongly about it. I remember some Belgian Catholic healthcare facilities that were trying to provide euthanasia, and Pope Francis was very strong against it, and he cut it out. Yes, so Pope Francis has talked about abortion and euthanasia a lot during his pontificate. And in fact, he also mentions it in Fratelli Tutti. He was one of the first popes to connect abortion to this concept that he also formulated, that is the throwaway culture. He does so specifically here in Fratelli Tutti, that the unborn children are also being destroyed, and this is a part of the throwaway culture that also pervades other aspects of social justice. This throwaway culture also happens towards the unemployed, towards the poor, towards the immigrant. And that's the thing. Maybe Francis it's not that he's soft on abortion, but he sees abortion, unborn children, as human beings in need of our defense as Catholics, but he sees also the immigrant, the poor, the sick. He also sees them in the same light. So we need to be coherent, and we cannot just sacrifice one person or one group of persons because our political party forces us to choose. No, as Catholics, we should not choose. We must defend everyone. There are priorities, of course, but we need to be consistent. We need to try to help everyone. We cannot let political parties impose on us this dichotomy. Oh, you have to attack this frail human being to protect this other frail human being. That's a perverse choice, a perverse dichotomy, and as Catholics we should not accept it. And Pope Francis usually places abortion in the context of the other struggles, so that we will know that if we cannot defend the immigrant and attack the unborn children, just like we cannot defend the unborn children and attack the immigrant. We need to be Catholics. We need to be Christian toward everyone.
I've got just two more questions,
Yes.
Pedro. Does Fratelli Tutti promote religious indifferentism? If not, then why not?
No, it does not promote religious indifferentism. In fact, Fratelli Tutti is is a Catholic encyclical. Now, I mentioned here, I have an article that is Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti and a Fresh Perspective on Tradition, in which I show that the concept of the cultural polyhedron that I mentioned before can actually be applied specifically to the Catholic faith. Pope Francis is resisting ideological colonization, not just from the West to the indigenous peoples, but also from secular cultures towards Catholic cultures. And that's something that the critics of the Pope have actually can agree on. They're always saying that governments or United Nations or whatnot, that they are interfering with our Catholic culture. That's also ideological colonization, and Pope Francis goes against it very strongly. And Fratelli Tutti also says that religions, and also obviously Catholic religions, also have a place at the table. So it cannot never be about religious indifferentism. Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti and in several other places, as I explained in that article, he says that we cannot defend other cultures if we don't have a strong identity of who we are. And who we are is Catholics. So he says that we need to defend our Catholic identity. But that does not mean that we can use that Catholic identity as a way to oppress the others or even to disrespect the others. It is part of our identity to respect the others, period.
What is the criticism with the most legitimacy and weight which you have come across in respect of this encyclical? We've covered a few of them already. I mean, I try to distill the objections that I saw into the most common ones, the most legitimate ones in my eyes. But have I missed anything? What is one that you've seen that I might not have asked you about in respect of Fratelli Tutti?
Of course, there might be some legitimate criticism, but at this moment, I think that for a legitimate criticism to appear, it needs to be the encyclical needs to be properly digested, discerned, and people that only after they incorporate the encyclical into their minds, only then will they be able to say, I don't know about this, or this doesn't make any sense, doesn't make much sense. At this moment, what I think is that papal critics have just tried to find ways to criticize, because that's something of a reaction they have when Pope Francis says something or does something. I'm going to criticize it, and I'm going to criticize it for the sake of criticizing it. The criticisms seem very shallow to me at this moment. It's a very big encyclical. I think that we will have to wait a bit until actual thoughtful criticisms can come at this moment. I think they were all too much pretexts to justify this anti-Francis narrative. There have been people that actually have been using Control F feature to search for keywords.
Indeed, yes.
Not mention Jesus Christ. Well, he mentions Jesus 33 times, so it's the way you use the tool. It's not about, but that's an excuse to not read it. It's an excuse to not read it. So I think that there might be legitimate criticisms, but it's still too early for them to surface. Legitimate criticisms come from deep study, not from shallow Control F looking for excuses of a complex, long document.
Pedro, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I think we've covered quite a few weighty topics. I don't want to hold you for much longer. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.